Good evening. Tonight, we examine two defining stories at the intersection of politics and economics. In our first segment, we turn to gold, which has soared to record high in 2025, marking its strongest performance since 1979. Analysts say this rally reflects more than market trends. It signals deep interests over inflation, the dollar, and sliding into geopolitical turbulence. Then, in our second segment, we shift to Argentina, where US President Donald Trump has unveiled a $20 billion swap in line to stabilize President Javier Milei's fragile economy. Supporters call it necessary intervention, critics call it election interference. Both stories reveal how financial markets are increasingly shaped by politics, power, and instability. I'm Mona Moselhi, and this is In Focus. The Guardian reports that gold has risen 45% since January, reaching $3,831 per ounce, outpacing every other major asset class this year. It is the best annual performance since 1979, when revolution in Tehran and an oil shock rocked the global economy. Gold is surging because investors are retreating from risk. Inflation worries, Trump's assaults on the Federal Reserve, trade wars, NATO-Russia tensions, and ballooning debt are driving demands for the only asset seen as incorruptible. Unlike copper or platinum, gold cannot be consumed away by industry. Its scarcity gives it staying power. Central banks, led by China, are stockpiling gold and even positioning themselves as custodians of other states' preserves. This isn't just diversification, it's a challenge to the US dollar's dominance, hinting at de-dollarization in motion. In 1979, gold's boom heralded seismic geopolitical shifts. Today, it may be telling us something just as profound. Well, joining us now is Mr. Meher Nicholas Frzili, Director of the EU Asian Center in Paris, to help us unpack why gold is hitting record highs and what this means for the global markets and power dynamics. Mr. Meher.
I'm delighted, Jonah.
Good to have you. Now, gold's 45% rise makes this its strongest year since 1979. What explains this historic rally?
I'm delighted once again to have you today. And I think we had an interview 6 months ago or 7 months ago. I was in Washington, D.C. during the IMF World Bank spring meetings. And I had said that, in my opinion, the price of gold would keep on rising substantially in the next semester. And I'm glad to see that my forecast came true. And I'll give you another one today. I think, in my personal opinion, it will keep on rising in the coming weeks and months. Why? Now, why is the big question? There are many reasons. Some are purely financial, but these days, finance itself is never far from geopolitics and geoeconomics. And so all these reasons are connected. I'll list a few of these reasons. The first one, unlike what people say in Europe and Asia, big investors, and when I say big investors, I mean big public pension funds from America itself, Canada, Holland, Australia, Singapore, and big sovereign wealth funds from Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, China. They haven't lost faith in America. So, people say, oh, investors are losing faith in America. That's why the euro to dollar exchange rate has moved in not a great way, and the US dollar is weak, blah, blah, blah. I think these critiques are not true. I think America is still attractive, right? Why America is attractive? Because in finance, when we look at countries, at assets, everything is relative. Nothing is absolute, right? So when big investors buy American assets, they're not doing it focusing only on one country. They compare countries, right? They compare countries and they still like America a lot. So they're still buying American assets, but they're buying American stocks, the shares of big American companies, yes. And that's why the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq are both breaking records, because there's billions of dollars flowing every day from Asia, Canada, the Arabian Gulf into America. But they are not buying the dollar, and they're not buying a lot of US bonds. That's why we see that the performance of American fixed income assets and the US dollar itself is not great. And maybe that's what Trump wants, because Trump is engaging into a new reindustrialization process. He wants to reindustrialize the Rust Belt, Middle America. He wants to export more and to import less. So I think for the Trump agenda, having a weak dollar within limits is good. Now, what about gold? Gold is a hedge, not because people don't like American assets. Like I said, big investors are still buying a lot of American assets, but it's a hedge against risk globally, against monetary risk globally, not only in America or in Europe or in Asia, but everywhere there is a monetary risk, because most central banks are debasing the value of their currencies. Not only the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, most central banks are printing money, and it destroys the long-term value of all currencies. And that's why gold is a hedge. One last remark, for the West, for Europe and America, it's also a self-inflicted wound, because what they have done in Russia, what they have done against Russia in the past 2.5 years following the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine is self-defeating. They have seized, the Europeans in particular, have seized illegally, completely illegally, hundreds of billions of Russian assets which were domiciled in Brussels, in Europe, and now they're using the proceeds from these Russian government assets to fund the war in Ukraine completely illegally, with no regard for international financial law. The Europeans are doing that, and that is having an effect on all financial markets the world over. The Arabs are watching, the Chinese are watching, the Indians are watching, saying, oh my God,
yes.
if they bring it.
But Mr. Meher, let me hear, we're speaking here about the gold and the rise in gold that has risen to enormous extents. Let me ask you, how much of this surge is tied to traditional drivers like interest rates and inflation, and how much is political? As you said, trade wars, sanctions, Trump's policies, Russia, Ukraine, all the issues that you spoke about.
Well, who's doing the buying? A lot of the buying is coming from India and China, and to a lesser extent, the Arabian Gulf, and it's coming from what we call SWFs, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. One of the reasons is clearly the government of Russia. They had trillions of dollars in Brussels, in the EU, and illegally the Europeans seized their money. So the Chinese and the Asians are saying, oh my God, it could happen to us in the future. It's too risky. Let me put some of my reserves, not in euro bonds in Brussels or Paris. Let me put them in a vault, in a physical vault, in Shanghai or Beijing or Riyadh, in gold bullion, right? That's one thing. Another reason, you are right, is a hedge against inflation, because interest rates, and here also Trump is right, interest rates are too high in countries like America, And inflation is coming back. We saw last week in Europe, inflation is spiking above 2%, and now economic growth in Europe is at 0%. So it's not good. And also there is infighting between policymakers and central bankers. So Trump and the Federal Reserve Board, it's becoming almost a joke. Every week Jerome Powell and Donald Trump exchange, insults or critics. It's not good for investors when they see the chairman of the central bank and the president having that kind of infighting. In Europe, we also have it. It's more polite, more civilized, but there is some kind of infighting between the European central banks and policymakers. So all that is what is doing what? Is creating psychological instability and the perception of risk is rising. And when the perception of risk is rising, you know what? People, what they do? They buy gold. So for all these reasons, people are buying gold massively.
If I may ask you here, does this mean that gold is the main beneficiary of the declining faith in US institutions? And let me here ask you something that you said here, that you said that Trump maybe he wants the dollar to decrease or to be limited or to limit its capacity in a way. Now, why do you think Trump would really work on the de-dollarization, and why would he be going to increase or benefit the gold instead, from your point of view?
Yeah, so here there's a delicate, you're absolutely right, there's a very delicate balance. So Trump and his entourage, they want probably the value of the US dollar vis-a-vis the pound and the euro and the yen to decline, yes, within limits, of course. The fact that people are buying gold is not something they care much about so far. And I say so far because most of the gold mines are in Australia, Eastern Canada, and Russia. So if gold keeps on rising, which is very likely, maybe Trump would say, oh my God, who's profiting? It's the Canadians and the Australians and the Russians. But let's not forget, American investors, they have a lot of shares in Australian and Canadian gold mines. So they are also profiting, if you see what I mean. Now, de-dollarization is something else. When you think of having China or India or ASEAN countries coming up with an alternative to the US dollar, right? That's something Trump does not want. So if the meaning of de-dollarize is having, a super yuan, a super Chinese yuan, or a BRICS currency unit, or even ASEAN currency unit, which longer down the road will eventually compete against the dollar, of course not. Trump is extremely hostile to that.
So you mean here, what I understand here is that he wants to decrease the value of the currencies at large while increasing the value of the gold instead, because they will benefit from that, because they are partners in some gold.
Yes. So what I'm saying is Trump wants to decrease within limits the relative value of his national currency, the US dollar, and he's not bothered so far by the rise of gold or the rise of bitcoins, by the way, right? But what bothers him is the potential rise of a super yuan BRICS currency unit, which in the future may challenge the American dollar. So I think, that's why Trump is maybe ambivalent and ambiguous here. Mixed feelings.
But if I get back, because I need to ask you about two issues here. China and the yuan. No, China is not just buying gold, but it is aiming to act as custodian of reserves. This is from one side. Plus, in 1979 revolution in Iran and oil shocks drove gold's boom Now, what do you think about China, and did it grasp the policies or the thoughts of the American administration? And from the other hand, do you see parallels with today's geopolitical turbulence?
So it's normal when you are a superpower, and now, let's be honest, Europe is no longer a superpower. That claim collapsed 2 months ago in Aberdeen on the 29th of July of this year, when Ursula von der Leyen abruptly, completely yielded to President Trump. The fiction of, the European Union being a superpower, that fiction completely died 2 months ago because of the many mistakes which Ursula von der Leyen and Macron did. So now there are only two superpowers left, China and America, and China is the challenger. So China is very strong in what field? In the field of heavy industry, in the field of construction, civil engineering, infrastructure, energy. China is consumer goods, electronics. China is super strong. But in the field of finance, China is still way behind America. So what do they want to do? The policy planners in Beijing, you're right, they want to catch up because, they were already able to catch up in so many fields. The only field, if I may, where the Chinese are far behind the West or the Americans is, Wall Street, the NASDAQ, financial markets, and having their currency being the rival or the challenger to the US dollar. But that's a long road. That will take China maybe 10, 15, 20 years, but they're long-term policy planners. So yes, they're working on that. But in the short term, I think what the Chinese are doing is defensive. The Chinese are playing defense here, not offense. They are being pressured by the West, by Europe and America quite aggressively. And so to defend themselves, the Chinese are trying now to invent a Pan-Asian or BRICS currency unit, not really to challenge the US dollar. Like I said, it will take them 15, 20 years, but at least to protect themselves from potential financial aggression from the part of Europe and America. So here, in my opinion, the Chinese are really playing a defensive game.
Mr. Maher Nicholas Frazeli, we thank you so much for joining us here on In Focus. And gold's rise is about far more than markets. It reflects global fears, shifting allegiances, and a profound rethinking of trust in the financial system. From Mali to Buenos Aires, both stories reveal how markets and politics are colliding. In Argentina, the Trump administration's $20 billion swap line is not only a financial move, but critics argue a political one. Foreign policy reports that Washington has stepped in with a $20 billion swap line for Argentina. The largest such move indicates President Milei promised libertarian reforms to crush inflation, and while the rate has dropped from nearly 300% to 34%, wages have fallen, unemployment has risen, and reserves are dangerously low, under $5 billion. The U.S. lifeline comes weeks before Argentina's midterm elections. Critics say it is an overt attempt to prop up Milei's government, ensuring an ideologically aligned leader survives politically. The precedent recalls Cold War interventions, but this time with a MAGA imprint. It raises urgent questions. Is this stabilizing Argentina or undermining democracy by buying influence? Joining us now from Buenos Aires is Mr. Tobias Belgrano, political researcher, to explore the risks and realities of Trump's extraordinary financial intervention. Mr. Tobias, so we thank you so much for being with us. Let me here start by asking, what exactly is a swap line, And why is the US offering one to Argentina now?
So a swap line is an exchange of currencies. The Argentinian government would provide the U.S. Treasury with Argentinian pesos, the national currency, and the U.S. would provide Argentina with U.S. dollars, generating special demand for that currency, which is already very demanded. However, we already have a swap line with China. Why? Because China wants to keep growing its demand and its international reserves in its currency. So that's the reason why the US is trying to provide a swap line, initially because the country currently has very low international reserves, which is a problem in Argentina, because as I was mentioning in other interviews here with you, this is a country where people have their savings in US dollars, and that's a problem for Argentina, as not any other country does that. Society has the savings in US dollars, and that generates an extra demand for the central bank's reserves, causing fluctuation in currency exchange and potentially more inflation.
Right. Meli's reforms cut inflation but left deep social scars. Now, how sustainable is his program?
Well, currently is what's being challenged, especially by Washington. The swap line has some conditions which are still rumors, but are part of the conditions that we already think we are seeing here in Buenos Aires, is that Milei needs to be more politically open to the opposition, which has not been the case. There's the need for more political stability, or what we call political stability, which is not the case for Javier Milei. The continuous discussions with the opposition, and especially with the governors that in Argentina have a lot of power, has shown how the Senate, with the senators respond directly to the governor, has shown a lot of defeats for the government. Every reform recently the government has tried to pass, it has been blocked by Congress, because the governors are very angry currently with the government, and that has effects politically, because Argentina is divided in many provinces, and these provinces have strong and powerful governors that might affect the electoral result for the government in October, which would affect the number of legislators the government has in Congress. With a small number of senators and deputies, the government is not able to show political strength to sustain the reforms and show the investors that the changes that the government is intending to impose are going to be stable in time, which is a problem with all the political noise that we are having right now.
Now, do you see this U.S. intervention as economic stabilization or outright election interference?
Well, I do think it's the second option. It's outright election interference, as the U.S. wants the government's economic plan has not worked. In April this year, the government has needed to ask the IMF for a loan to keep its program moving. And now again, after that loan, it's been used by the government. The government needs again another loan from the US. So if you are a government that you have a economic program that demands you keep borrowing from abroad to be able to provide stability, you are not able to provide stability. So another country has to provide it for you. And this is the case for the US. Secretary Scott Bessent has even said that the U.S. Treasury would buy Argentinian debt bonds, which are currently known in the market as trash bonds. So, yes, it's a clear intervention to show, especially to the other countries of Latin America, that being a sideline with Trump pays back. If you're an ally of Mr. Trump, you're going to be paid back, and this is part of the payment that Javier Milei is now receiving for his continuous adulation of Mr. Trump and his closeness to the Republican administration.
Mm-hmm. Many compare this to Mexico's 1995 bailout. So is Argentina's case similar or more severe?
Well, it's similar in the level of intervention. What the problem is that it's not politically related, the Mexico one, and also the problem is that Mexico it's a strong ally, commercial ally of the U.S. in many industries. However, Argentina competes with the U.S. with its industry, and this has been a problem because the government needs to accumulate foreign reserves, international reserves, with loans or with reduction of export taxes, which is what happened last few weeks. After the government reduced export taxes, China bought a lot of soybean from Argentina, which caused a lot of anger and resentment for the U.S. farmers, which are complaining with Scott Bessent and the Republicans, saying you are providing Argentina a bailout and helping them and helping our competitor, while we are not able to sell to China, and Argentina is now selling all the China demand instead of us. We're not able to compete with Argentina because we are conflicted with China. Now Argentina is coping the market. And this has been a problem. Even the Secretary Bessent had to give some answers because of this situation.
But then when we go to the other side, and Trump's Treasury insists this is a liquidity crisis, not a structural one. What do you have on that?
Well, Argentina is a very complex economy, so I would say it's mainly a structural one. As I was saying at the beginning, the country has to recurrently ask for international loans to keep the program working, and the liberalization, even the liberalization or privatization of public company has not been moved forward. The states keep paying the pensioners, the elderly for their pensions, and has not even been able to privatize that. And without that political capability, it's fighting a Congress that it's against many of the reforms the government is trying to implement. So it's a very hard place to be, especially if politically you're not able to sustain the reforms. I think this has to do with a political intention rather than an economic liquidity problem.
Mm-hmm. So whether it's liquidity or structural one, what risks does this carry for the US if Argentina will not be able to stabilize?
Well, the main problem is that the country needs to accumulate foreign reserve, which has not been doing it during 2025. During 2025, the government stopped accumulating international reserves, which was a problem because the country has IMF loans to pay, and also the American loan to pay now, or the American swap. If the country needs to accumulate reserves, that would cause further demand, extra demand for the dollar in the formal market, which will rise the currency exchange, making peso weaker. If Argentinian peso is weaker and the dollar rises, this trend tends to translate on prices and inflation. So if we have more inflation, this will affect the popularity of Javier Milei. So probably in the end, what the U.S. Treasury will see is that they are paying an ally, or they are trying to help an ally which is politically non-viable, and they are wasting the U.S. taxpayers' money for an ally that won't be able to transcend for a second term.
This is on the economic side. If we speak politically, how does this affect Argentina's ties with China, which has also provided swap lines?
Well, the tension is there, but it's also not a smart move from the U.S. either, because currently the U.S. is not, the market liberalization of Argentina is not being taken advantage by U.S. production. There's not an import boom of U.S. production goods rather than Chinese production goods. So currently the U.S. government is providing a bailout to the Argentinian government to keep currency exchange low, so Argentinians are able to go on vacations abroad, to buy Shein, the Chinese platform app, or Temu app. Things that come from China. The import avalanche is coming from China, not from the US. So it doesn't make sense. Also,
so Mr. Tobias, before we end, and very briefly, Does this reveal Trump's broader Latin America strategy, geopolitical economics, or simply politics?
No, it's of course Trump's geopolitical approach of showing loyalty to the ones who are loyal to the US and punishing the ones who are not.
Right. Mr. Tobias Belgrano, we thank you so much for your insights. Argentina's crisis and Washington's gamble remind us that in today's world, economics is inseparable from politics. Tonight we saw how gold's meteoric rise reflects not just financial fear, but global realignment, and how Argentina's bailout reveals the raw politics behind US economic power. Together, these stories remind us that money, power, and politics are converging, reshaping the world before our eyes. I guess that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Focus. Many thanks for watching.